Hello everyone, this is Ben Dunn, your AP Sensei, founder of Antarctic Press, a comic book publishing company established in 1985, celebrating its 40th anniversary. Creator of such comics as Warrior Nun, Ninja High School, Tomorrow Girl, Mighty Tiny, a host of others, and the Marvel Mangaverse. So, recently I thought about what's going on in the comic industry and the advent of AI and the changing technology that's coming around, and people feeling kind of apprehensive about the whole industry in general with Diamond and everything else like that. And it got me wanting to read some of the old comic books that I used to grow up with back in the day. The likes of Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko, Jim Steranko, Neil Adams, and, a host of other comic book artists. And that, got me thinking, the way that the things are nowadays, it made me wonder whether or not those big name comic book artists from the past could get a job today. If there was a Jack Kirby right now, he was a young man wanting to break into comics, drawing the way he does, do you think he would have been hired by Marvel or DC or any other comic book publishing company? And what about Steve Ditko? What about Jim Steranko? What about Barry Smith? What about Bernie Wrightson? What about Neil Adams? All those comic book artists of the past who defined a generation of comics, would they be able to get work today? I'm sure some of them would have. Maybe their style would resonate with Marvel or DC in such a way that they would probably hire them. But I don't, part of me doubts that very much. The thing about those artists is that they were artists. They created a style uniquely theirs that was, identifiable to their character, to their vision. When I look at a Marvel or DC, I find it really difficult to distinguish one artist from the other. They all seem to come out of the same, machine or school that somehow wants them to draw in one particular fashion that just doesn't seem to stand out anymore, especially the interior. Now, cover artists, that's different. It seems like Marvel and DC are spending all their money on cover artists. They're investing very little in the interior art. I think there should be a written rule that no comic book should have a cover that isn't drawn by the guy who does the interior. I mean, how would you think that would affect sales? How do you think people would respond to that? Would Marvel and DC decide, hey, maybe we should get artists that, that can actually draw people in? Now, I'm not saying that people who are drawing comics now are terrible. No, I'm not saying that at all. I am saying they lack style. They lack an identifiable style that immediately evokes, oh, I know who that is. Oh, I know who drew that. I can't tell one artist from another. Back in the day, back in my day, I could tell a Jack Kirby, a Steve Ditko, a Bernie Wrightson, a Barry Smith, a Jim Steranko, a Neil Adams, any number of artists out there. I said, Jack Kirby didn't draw like Jim Steranko. Barry Smith, at first was trying to draw like Jack Kirby, but he found his own voice and drew his own style and created his own vision. To all you artists out there, if you really want to beat AI, create a style that it can't easily replicate. There's a reason why so many people are using the Studio Ghibli. I mean, the thing is that you can immediately identify that it is Studio Ghibli. Why do you think it uses it as its basis point? Because it's something that easily is identifiable. And the thing is that people immediately can say and look at that and says, hey, that's Studio Ghibli. the thing about it is that, I would like to think that Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, all these artists, they could find, crowdfunding and develop their own book, and they can see if people really like, the style that they draw in. It's debatable whether or not you could say that any one of those artists could, make it in today's environment. Would Jack Kirby be able to be, a big name artist now? I don't know. I mean, the thing about it was that he grew up he worked at a time where publishers owned everything that creators created, and that is unfortunate for them, because that was the way the industry was. That was the industry standard, except for a few exceptions. Will Eisner was one of those creators who knew that he wanted to own what he created, and he was able to fight for that, and he was successful in that. So it wasn't like it was out of left field that a creator couldn't fight for ownership of what he created, because they held the keys to the kingdom. It was up to them to use it to open the door for the publishers, and they were all adults. They could have realized that, even even as you go back far as the Superman, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, they owned Superman, and they were forced to sell it, or they decided to sell it. A lot of people don't talk about that, but they sold it, to DC Comics, to national periodicals. And it's just, they knew what they were doing. They decided that they were going to cash in, and they sold it at a price they thought was amenable. The same way as me. I sold Warrior Nun to Avatar Comics. I knew what I was doing. I needed the money, and I decided that's what I was going to do. So I don't blame them. I was totally, as an adult, I knew what I was doing. And that's why I always feel, why are these so-called industry professionals who are supposedly so smart can't figure out a simple thing like a contract to protect their rights? It just befuddles me, and I laugh at that, because it seems to me they're not, they're just crying sour grapes in my opinion. And now, while I do sympathize that maybe the publisher should, take pity on them and give them something for their efforts, they are under no obligation to do so. And quite frankly, I can't disagree with that. So I'm just going to leave that as a little notation that somehow we creators need to be smarter, and we need to be aware of what our rights are. That there is a distinction between work for hire and a creator-owned work of art. You have to be able to distinguish between the two. Teach yourself copyright and trademark. Read all your contracts carefully. Make sure you protect yourself if this is something that somebody else is going to handle. If it's on your own, you have no problem with that. There's no, what you create, you own. You make it very clear that whoever you hire, that they are working for you, and that you, unless you want to share in the copyright, you own everything. And you have to make that very clear to the people you hire. And the same thing would go with, everybody who works in comics. They have to realize that when they were working for them, that they were under the auspices of being work for hire. And if you think about it, a lot of the times the writers are the ones who created the character. All the artists, it was to interpret what the writer wanted. And so I think there's the time for whining and complaining about how the industry is treating you is over. You need to grow up. You need to understand that there is plenty of opportunity out there if you're creative enough and create something that people like to make money in this industry. There's many examples of that currently in the independent comic book scene. You know, 15, 20, 30 years ago, it would have been laughable for any independent comic, short of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, to sell, outsell Marvel and DC. And now here we are. There are independent comics outselling Marvel and DC, or at least making more money. Now, don't get me wrong, Marvel and DC, they're huge behemoths, and it's going to take quite a bit for them to ever come down, if they will ever. They're being propped up by huge amounts of money. So it's highly likely they're going to experience any kind of downfall. And the sooner we realize, that they're not to be trifled with, then you need to move on to something else. Focus on your own thing. Focus on your own creation. Focus on your own little slice of the empire. Create your own kingdom. And this way you can build up from there. It's all a matter of your ability to take what you have and to, exploit it to the fullest extent that you possibly can. And if it works, great. If it doesn't, you need to pivot. You need to say, well, maybe this idea didn't work. Let me try this. That's the beauty of comics. You can create things from whole cloth in an instant. You can create things as fast as your imagination will allow you. The trick is being able to sell it to the public. Being able to make enough money, not only to be trustworthy and reliable, but to create something that people can identify with and adhere to. So would Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko be able to find work? Maybe not in the mainstream, but I tell you what, they probably would do just fine in the independent comic sphere. So until next time, this has been Dunn signing off.
Hey there. Do you like action, adventure, and return to classic superheroes? Then you'll love Tomorrow Girl, Flight to the Future. A 128-page full-color collection of her best stories now on Indiegogo. Be a backer today. Link down below.